I worked at DIA for 9 years, and in that time I heard our next speaker talk a number of times, and I was always left really challenged and thinking, and so I'm really looking forward to what Richard has to say today. Richard's the Chief Archivist at the National Archive, and I love the title of his talk, the past is dead, the present is fleeting, we live in the future, so where's my flying car? Well, that's not in the title, that was what I thought. And maybe Richard will be able to tell me if we'll be getting flying cars soon, maybe not. I asked Richard what superpower he would like to have. We had a bit of discussion about that and settled on time travel, which I thought was quite cunning because you could travel into the future and find a technology that replicated other superpowers so you could have all of them. And also asked him what he wanted to do when he was 10, and he said he wanted to be an astronaut, which is a kind of time travel in its own way. So please join me in welcoming Richard.
Inga mana, inga reo, inga ro ranga tenama, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you, Matt, for the very warm welcome. I'm Richard Foy. This is my avatar. I'm going to use this occasionally during my talk. And before I kind of get started into the thrust of it, I thought I'd just give you a bit of an idea of where I'm from, or what you might call Turanga Waiwai, or Ukaipotanga, my sort of sense of where I'm from. Now, you're a pretty astute bunch. You're looking at me, and I would assume that you've picked up a few of my telltale signs of my whakapapa and where I've come from, such as my funny name, because ko Wongwakwhi toko ingoa tuturu, or ko Richard Foy aho, as I would go about in the normal world. My jet black hair, which is tinged with a little bit of white because I'm middle-aged. My genetic myopia or short-sightedness, and the gentle slope or slant of my hypnotic almond-shaped brown eyes. And then, of course, I know Kung Fu. So, yeah, you're looking at me and you're thinking, I've got the measure of that guy. I know where he's from. I know his people. And you should feel no shame in that. You should not feel bad at all. I don't judge you, because you'd be 100% right. I'm from Wainyamata. New Zealand's absolute heartland. And I got this photo actually from the Alexander Turnbull Library, an archival library, and it's circa 2017. It's a pretty recent photo. Those absolutely looks like that. I was there a couple of weeks ago. Actually, when I was trying to get there, I used Apple Maps and Siri. And FYI, if you want to talk to Siri about Wainyamata, well, Siri says it's Wainometer. So I really need to have a talk to Apple about that. I'm a long-time technophile, like many of you here. So that's a picture of me, which I'm covering up because that's ugly, with the mullet. That's from when I was in 4th form. And of course, the cool kids out there will be looking at this render of an Apple IIe, which actually Mick Crouch, he's here in the room. I was just downstairs in lower level 2, I think, and there's a whole stash of these down there because I think they're decommissioning them, so we should get them for the DigiLab. Yeah. Anyway, I'm like any other kid. I wanted to become an astronaut. I couldn't do that. I thought about Starfleet. That wasn't a thing, so I joined the public service. But like every kid growing up in Wainyamata, certainly in the 70s and 80s, well, 70s, I had some idols. You know, this was my idol. I wanted to become Chewbacca. So anyway, that's kind of where I started. That's my Turanga Waiwai. But today I'm here as the Chief Archivist or the General Manager of Archives New Zealand. So I'm tūmaki o Te Rua Mahara o Te Kāwanatanga. And a lot of people often ask me, certainly my family did when I started this job, which is, what the heck is the Chief Archivist? What is that? My brother, one of my older brothers, who's an idiot, he said, you're like the director of artifacts, right? I was like, no. But I really like that notion of artifacts and sort of adventure and history to begin with. So I thought, yeah, I'll go with that. Maybe like I'm an archaeologist. Nah. But then I took that a little bit further. Well, actually, that's kind of old-fashioned. this is really, you know, maybe I'm a raider of tombs and I'm using the skills to hunt and gather things. No. So I did find this little thing. So I'll just, hopefully the audio comes out okay. Yeah.
Did you call for assistance?
Yes, I did.
Are you having a problem, Master Kenobi?
Yes,
Yeah, baby. Joe Castanu, who's a Jedi archivist. Obi-Wan Kenobi, you probably haven't heard of him. He's not very well known. But Joe Castanu, she's a Master Jedi. She's got a lightsaber. She sits on the Jedi Council, and she is the Jedi archivist. This scene is from Star Wars Attack of the Clones. It's a prequel. We won't speak of that ever again. Sorry, Mick. And yeah, she represents for me, fantastic. You know, there's an archivist inside Star Wars. How more perfect can you get? She's got a beautiful little archive inside the Jedi Temple in Coruscant. It looks like that. Actually, some people might recognize it's kind of, I think, modeled after Trinity College in Dublin. Anyway, my temples don't quite look like that. But we have 4 archival repositories around New Zealand: Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, and Dunedin. And this is kind of what they look like. Yeah. Oh, that's still pretty good. I will admit that I have a bit of a box and photo fetish. So I love these things. And these are little Toblerones. But yeah, here's a little bit of a little factoid for you. These are the number of kilometers or linear kilometers of storage space that we have in terms of files and records that we have. So it's about 143 kilometers, an enormous number of records and information. And actually, it's about the distance from here to Palmerston North. But that won't mean anything to you guys. I want to be an astronaut, so in better terms, it's kind of the distance between the Earth, the nap of the Earth, and the thermosphere. So actually kind of not too far off from where the space shuttle kind of orbits. Anyway, yeah, we've got repositories around the country. I'm really probably just going to talk a little bit about the Wellington one to begin with. I'm going to use a Game of Thrones reference because that makes life fun. It makes work at archives a bit more interesting, doesn't it, Mick? You know, when we're kind of living in the Game of Thrones world. And so archives on Mulgrave Street, that's East Watch by the Sea. We're obviously on the wall of the Night's Watch. National Libraries just down the street, Castle Black. Department of Internal Affairs, Shadow Tower. That's in a new building there. And obviously down the bottom is King's Landing, the seat of power, the seat of political intrigue, and where brothers and sisters love each other. So I showed you a picture of the Jedi Archive before. Woo! We lost a bit. Oh, there we go. There's the Jedi Archive. This Jedi Archive. Oh, what's going on, guys? There we go. Okay. Hopefully we'll stay there. Good. Okay. This is what my building looks like, the National Archive building, or the Archives New Zealand building. It's like a complete facsimile. It's like they took the Jedi Temple and they just rendered it in 3 dimensions as the National Archives. It's just beautiful, isn't it? Just down the street, and I'm the Lord Commander there, just down the street is the National Library building, and Bill McNaught, National Librarian, he's Lord Commander there. And we've got a little bit of presence there, a little bit of archives down at the National Library. A little thing called the He Tohu exhibition, a 25-year permanent exhibition of our 3 most iconic constitutional documents, He Whakaputanga, Te Tiriti, o Waitangi, and the Women's Suffrage Petition. So it's a little outpost of archives at National Library. And I like to think of it as the best room in the house. Yeah. And there you'll find these incredible documents, not just historical documents, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, but incredible documents and records of government. Now, who has been to He Tohu? Okay, quite a few. So I'm going to assume that everyone else has not, in which case we're going to pause this presentation. You're going to go down to the National Library and watch it because we've got all day. But no, seriously, you should all go down and experience He Tohu. You should take your friends, your families, your workmates, and you probably want to do that many times if you can. So anyway, that's at the National Library. This is what archives looks like. National Library, Archives, you might be seeing a bit of a pattern here. National Library, Archives. And, you know, a lot of people ask me when I joined Archives, like, what the heck's the difference? You know, aren't these kind of things just the same, an archive and a library? I mean, you've got, you know, old things, you've got paper, and you stick them away in big buildings that are very imposing on the landscape. And you know, yeah, it's made me think. So, you know, you've got to Google it. And if you do Google it, you'll see some interesting things. I Googled it the other night, so I'll just show you a little bit of the stuff coming up. And so an archive is largely focused on records and documents of, yes, historic significance sometimes, about place and institutions and people. It comes from the word archive and public records of government. So that's what an archive generally is about. And a library, well, probably most people are familiar with libraries, largely focused on books and collections of books and lending of books, so relating to books. So we get this interesting comparison between an archive and a library. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit. So the big question is, what's the difference between records and, or these kinds of records anyway, right? Between records and books. So if you put away the sort of moral and ethical and maybe just what it feels like when people mention book burning, but if you took a book like Harry Potter's Philosopher's Stone in the library and you burned it, would that be tragic? Well, you could probably replace it because there's a whole bunch of those published works and you can get a new one. So yeah, it would be kind of sad, but it's not the worst thing in the world. With a lot of records, because they're entirely unique, they are singular things that only exist, and you know, they can be copied, but they are unique artifacts, unique records, unique documents. So when they're destroyed, we get kind of sad. And it did happen. It happened in 1952, in fact. There was a huge conflagration in the Hope Gibbons building, which is down on Taranaki and Dixon Street. There's a sports bar there now. And because of that fire, which destroyed many records across government, many unique documents about the memory of government, the Archives Act of 1957 was created. And then that begat the Public Records Act of 2005, which is our authorising legislation today. And this is one of the survivors of the Hope Gibbons fire. And really, that leads me to sort of kind of explain to you that I see records as evidence. Records as evidence of us, evidence of events and transactions, of determinations and decisions taken by government about citizens and people's rights, about their entitlements and the actions that have been taken, and sometimes about promises and commitments that have been made by government to the public. So it puts in, I guess, a different focus these types of documents, not just historic documents of cultural value or about national identity, but these are records as evidence. They're not just historic documents. They're evidence of, actually, of us. And therefore, we think about what one of the key roles of archives is not just collecting and holding things, but we enable the accountability of government through these records, and we enable that accountability. So, and in particular, you think about the type of accountability that relates to a treaty in terms of the promises and the commitments that are made. There's a commitment there, there's a bit of evidence of it there in terms of William Hobson's signature, but there's also a whole bunch of evidences there in terms of lots and lots of signatures by tupuna who put their mark, their tohu on Te Tiriti. Another way to think about accountability is to look maybe not so far in history. So I'm going to use here an example which is around the Stasi and the East Germans. And some of you may have seen this film called The Lives of Others, which was about a Stasi officer who surveilled a couple of East German citizens and kept meticulous records of their movements, of what they did day to day, of things that they were meetings they had with people, conversations. And this was set in 1984, and during the time of still the Cold War and when East Germany was still a thing. This is from a Wired magazine article, which is about the reconstruction of the East German records. But this is how they kept their records. I mean, if you can put aside the evil of those kind of authoritarian regimes, you can kind of like go, wow, they're pretty boxes with really good files. I mean, that's beautiful. So thousands, probably millions of records kept about citizens, of their lives, of their day-to-day businesses, and every interaction they had, and probably things they ate, kept in these files. Which kind of leads me to, this kind of moment when I think about, well, secrecy in a surveillance authoritarian society versus an open, democratic, free society like ours. Is there really a heck of a lot of difference? Well, not in some ways, because this is what we have in Archives New Zealand. These kinds of boxes and photos, they look almost exactly the same. Beautiful photos of art. This is in the Turnbull Library. This is one of my favourite areas, actually. So that idea of secrecy versus openness, both types of regimes, on the good side and the bad side, require the making and the keeping of records. And I think that's just a really heavy thing. It's like, it's almost the banality of record keeping. And in terms of accountability, the East Germans, the Stasi, decided to try and destroy them. So here's taking records like that, and they were turned into these. So that turned into, I think, 15,000 bags of bits of torn up paper that needed to be reassembled and put onto shelves. And eventually, through a process a little bit manual and using some technology, they were able to reconstitute that record. Which leads me to another thought in terms of this idea of destruction and reconstruction. It's not just about evidence of us, but it's also evidence of them, of a regime or a state that imposed their will, their authority upon a population. And that's kind of a very prosaic way to think of it in terms of evidence. Another way that we often use is to talk about memory. So the evidence is kind of memory. Archives New Zealand is often referred to as the memory of government. So it's memories of us and memories of them. And this kind of wanton destruction of records is actually, if you tried to do that here in New Zealand, would actually be an offence under the Public Records Act. And I would have to do something about that. Yeah. So the openness and secrecy leads to another kind of interesting kind of juxtapositional contrast, light versus dark. You can see where I'm going here. Republic versus Empire. Jedi versus Sith. So let's have a look. That's the Jedi temple in Coruscant. Well, everyone has to keep good records, don't they? So does the Empire. They have an imperial archive on the planet of SCARIF. Okay, so I'm about to show you something that's kind of graphic. I think you're all adults, and I think you can handle this. But strong discretion is advised.
You may fire when ready.
Whoa, that was heavy. What you saw was unauthorized disposal of records, ladies and gentlemen. That should have made everyone's heart sink when they saw that. Okay, there were probably some people killed in that too, but unauthorized disposal. I'm pretty sure that the imperial chief archivist, well, they shouldn't have allowed that. But in those types of regimes, they don't often have the kinds of checks and balances. They don't have like what I have, which is statutory independence. So someone can't tell me to authorize the disposal. So the minister can't tell me to do that. Chief executive can't tell me to do that. That is something that's within my mandate. So yeah, that's a big deal. They need to work on that. So this idea of memory and history and heritage, we often talk about that in terms of like this idea of memory as being part of your identity, the thing that determines yourself. We worry about losing our memory. But I think it's actually got another purpose as well. So instead of just being about history, historic, heritage value, it's this idea that I can take memory in terms of what I remember and evidence of what I remember, and I will sometimes need to use that to help me make good decisions and help me figure out whether the things I'm about to do or will do in the future is right or wrong. And there's this notion that memory enables a conscience. And this idea of conscience is something that's actually weighed on me quite a lot lately in terms of our role in government. So people often think of National Library as the memory of New Zealand society, Archives New Zealand as the memory of New Zealand government, but we also work really closely with other agencies and offices like the Privacy Commissioner and the Ombudsman. And this really moves this role and function of Archives New Zealand beyond just being about neutral memory and a record, but actually being part of the conscience and conscience apparatus of New Zealand government. And so I drew this picture. I'm calling it a triad because I'm Chinese, so why wouldn't I? And triads are good, but you can think of a trilogy or a triumvirate, Holy Trinity, but the confluence of these three offices and these three institutions, backed by some really important legislation like the Official Information Act for the Ombudsman, the Privacy Act by the Privacy Commissioner, and the Public Records Act for the Chief Archivist, forms a really important bundle and connection around conscience. And it becomes really, really important when we start thinking about stuff that's happening in our world. So I learned just recently that in 2016, the Oxford Dictionary word of the year was post-truth. Post-truth. And what does post-truth mean to us? Is it actually just, at a time when the truth doesn't exist? Or is it actually something more ominous? I think it's probably something more ominous because I think it actually starts to lead us into a time when actually there's a loss of trust, not just a loss of honesty and truth. It's very Orwellian. 1984 is probably a really good thing to go back to. Remember that the lives of others and the Stasi were actually in existence in 1984. And one of the things that we think of from 1984, the idea of newspeak, fake news, alternative facts, that's something that's been pretty prevalent in the media. But actually what people don't often talk about, or they kind of forget around 1984, is this idea of doublethink. This idea that we can actually take a truth and flip it around and talk about it in the opposite and still hold those as being okay. And this idea that you can rewrite history, rewrite the records as they did in the Ministry of, of Communication or Information in 1984. And so that does introduce this idea of the state as Big Brother. But nowadays we're actually starting to get a bit more worried about business as Big Brother, aren't we? And that has become very much a reality. Oh, is that real? Yeah, that shit just got real. And actually, I'm not going to go into detail around Westworld and Delos, because I'm going to assume that some of you have probably seen this, but that's kind of like even future thinking about big business as Big Brother. So let's go back to there and the conscience of government. But if this does exist, if people should and can fear the state as Big Brother, and obviously that happens in sort of authoritarian regimes, much less here in New Zealand, then the conscience of government actually has a really important role for us in terms of being one of the pillars of the democracy and the checks and balances that we have to ensure that we have the kind of rights and entitlements and the free life that we expect to have and that we want to have. There's a guy called A.C. GRAYLING, who's a philosopher. He actually gave a speech in Wellington not that long ago, and I managed to listen to that off Radio New Zealand. And he talked about government needs to be responsible, accountable, transparent, and he used this word, recordable records. We need to records. He comes from the UK where they had a lot of problems with Windrush. People come from Jamaica, I can't remember, and then come to Jamaica, and there were a lot of controversy, a lot of sort of political interference. There's a lot of things about policy that was going on there, and there was a loss of the records of that. So not only were those refugees and immigrants losing access to their record and their identity, but actually government was ceasing to become accountable because of that. For me, that resonates well with me, given that I'm Chinese, because there used to be a Chinese Immigrants Act of 1881 that had very strong restrictions on Chinese people coming to New Zealand. But because of that, we had really good record keeping, like this, a poll tax certificate for a gentleman called Wong Jim who paid £100 in poll tax, and here are his fingerprints. And there's a photo of him there. That's my granddad. And until a couple of years ago, I'd never seen my granddad, but I found him in the archives. Found him in the National Archives, both his photo and his fingerprints and information about him. So it's this interesting idea that even when you've got kind of interesting policies and regimes, good record keeping can lead to good memories. And that whole thing around the immigration tax led to an apology by the New Zealand government. So think about this, all those records being built up and used over time in negotiations with the Chinese community by the New Zealand government to form an apology, so accountability. We are kind of all over that now though, so I'm all good with Helen. So this idea that Public Records Act is about accountability also comes to play that the Public Records Act is about regulation, about regulating against harm. Harm such as corruption in New Zealand, and transparency. So Transparency International, which works very closely with the public service to ensure that we have a non-corrupt public service. And if you want to use any kind of metric, the CPI, Corruption Perceptions Index, is probably a good one. And who's number one? Woohoo! We're like the gold standard. But, you know, we shouldn't rest too easy on our laurels. There was a survey just done last year. This is done every few years. Trust and confidence in members of parliament compared with lots of other professions. And you have a look at that. We're in there. People who work for the government. A lot of you are public servants. Some of you may not be, but you work with us. And you have a look at this. Ooh, highly rated professions, poorly rated professions. We're kind of in there. Went up for a bit, we've gone down for a bit. So, oh no, makes you kind of a bit sad. And yeah, this was something from a few years ago. Robots, love robots. So what does this mean for an archivist and archives? Well, I don't know if you've read this report. Most of you probably haven't. Some of you will have. Go read it, it's fantastic. It's our annual report, the Chief Archivist's annual report to Parliament, so this is part of my statutory responsibilities. We talk about the state of record keeping and information management within government. We do this on an annual basis. So it took a different approach this year to really start to focus on what some of the key issues going forward for an archival institution and government record keeping and information management might be. And it's not just about creating value through good information and bureaucracy and governance, but actually about some other really interesting ideas around data and algorithms. So one of the things that one of the key ideas was this, ensuring the accountability of government when key decisions actually made by machines. Like this. Computer says no. What happens when a computer or an algorithm or a machine starts to make decisions based on whatever? And, you know, a lot of the times the algorithms are pretty well understood. Sometimes they're not able to be discerned or understood well. And I'll point you to this film about Google AlphaGo, which is a really interesting thing when you think about what its implications for us are. So, AlphaGo.
Beating a professional player at Go is a long-standing challenge of artificial intelligence.
Everything we've ever tried in AI just falls over when you try the game of Go.
The number of possible configurations of the board is more than the number of atoms in the universe.
Wow. So that's kind of cool. In that game, if you ever go watch the documentary or if you read the commentary as they were playing the game a few years ago, as I did, so I quite like I'm not a Go player, but I've played it in the past, and I was just fascinated by this idea of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and actually that human machine battle, because I suspect many of you have, followed the Kasparov versus the IBM computer that then became Watson. I can't remember what it's called. But in game 2, move 37, there was this inexplicable move that AlphaGo made, placing a piece on the board that just completely threw Lee Sedol, who's the world champion at Go, completely changed the moment in the game, and he lost that game. And commentators who were watching were like completely in awe of that move, and it's referred to as like a divine move or a move of God. Completely, almost like, what? No one would do that. No one would do that move. And I noticed there was a tweet earlier. I think Victoria talked about a quote from Grace Hopper, and it was something like, computers will never ask new questions. Was that a thing that was said? Watching something like AlphaGo in action and them trying to figure out why AlphaGo did this move it did actually makes you wonder whether that actually is a truism or not. Grace Hopper would have said that quite a long time ago. So it makes me think, in terms of accountability of government, how do we How do we hold algorithms and government to account when they start to make divine moves in terms of decisions, when they're completely inscrutable to us? I don't have the answer to that, by the way. Machine learning in a more positive sense for archives, and this is something that we've been trying to do, and this has often been seen as the holy grail, where, when I started working in this space, a lot of people said, oh yeah, we can take, printed things and we can digitize that, and we can transcribe it very easily, but man, we're never going to do any of that joined up cursive writing, because even humans can't read that. And yet, there is now this is open source software transcribers, and we've done a few experiments, and we plan to do more, which uses a combination of crowdsourcing and machine learning in order to take all that kind of joined up inscrutable writing and turn it into actual typed text. So that kind of connects, to the latter part of my talk, which is about, where we're going in the future. If the Hope Gibbons fire was literally our first burning platform, then what's on fire now? Well, the first bit of fire is Steve Jobs. No, I'm just kidding. The first bit of fire isn't the iPad and Steve Jobs, but really, I suppose, the technology and the ubiquity of that technology that's in the hands of citizens and New Zealanders and people who are wanting to access the information and the holdings of institutions like archives and like a library. The fact that it's become ubiquitous, and it's kind of what people expect. They don't want to be having to come into our offices where the privilege of place is the thing that allows people to have access to their information. Another part of that fire, and I've used my daughter Lucy quite often, but for me, she still remains a really key disruptor in the world that I'm thinking about and have to develop for. And the idea that she's living in this completely different world than we've all grown up in, and therefore she has different expectations. And if I take Lucy and I take something like an iPad or a mobile phone, and I take the fact that she's got different expectations of a government, of being a citizen today or citizen in the future than we've had, then that's a hugely disruptive force. Another disruptive force is the way the government is thinking about how it's going about and doing its work. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what they were thinking when they did this photo for the Dominion Post, but man, it's out there, so I'm using it. But the GCDO, the GCDS, or the GCPO, or the GICDO, GICDIS, and the GICPO, as I like to call them, that they are absolutely about the transformation of government to become digital government, and where we're starting to look at how we can exploit, well, not exploit, it's probably the wrong word, leverage, use big data, artificial intelligence, but how we can still manage and govern and take care of people's personal privacy and ensure that their digital rights and their physical rights are well looked after. And for me, this is about how we have to start thinking about enabling accountability in a digital government world. And then, of course, for us, we've got this kind of like tsunami of digital content and holdings and information out there, and our archival and collection and holding institutions feel like that little Mount Fuji, I presume, Fujiyama, that's about to be swamped by the tsunami. I talked to Kirsty from CAA, Civil Aviation Authority, before, and she was telling me, no, like we're the first organisation to do a digital transfer to archives. So that was absolutely fantastic. And this is the idea that we no longer have to just take boxes of records to stick on our shelves. Though that would make me very sad if we stopped doing that. We can also take transfers digitally of thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of records in digital form in the future, which makes me sort of think, actually, I'm going to go back to Game of Thrones. The digital winter is coming because we've got this impending onslaught from the cloud in terms of the volume and scale and speed at which content is created, the various formats that some of which we know about today but are changing constantly, and what artificial intelligence is doing in terms of accountability. And so it's heading towards the war, the digital winter, which then means that the Night's Watch is really just a metaphor for archivists. Except we've got much better diversity. So I have a much better gender balance, better ethnic balance than the Night's Watch. But I looked at the key characteristics of the Night's Watch, the key principles, and I feel that we do share much the same. We reject land and titles. So, we don't necessarily earn as much as we could elsewhere. and we don't, we have meagre means. We're very neutral when it comes to politics because we'll outlast any particular government or administration. We're there for the long run. We never desert our assignments. We don't give up on pain of death. We practice celibacy. Okay, now we're cancelling that one, aren't we, mate? We're cancelling that one. And of course, we're really undermanned. Like we need more resources. We need more building space. We need more people. So what are we going to do about that impending change? What are we doing about the winter that's coming and the future? We created a strategy, Archives 2057. That's like even further than Blade Runner 2049. Fantastic. And it's got 3 key themes, which I'll just touch on here. Taking archives to the people is all about meeting that digital disruption front on, about expanding our channels away from being points of presence and merely places that you have to go to. I mean, we'll still have some of those, but it's about opening up channels interactively and digitally for our customers and ensuring that our commitments to iwi and Māori are much, much better aligned with Te Tiriti and Kaupapa Māori. We also have a theme around upholding transparency, and this is really the idea that accountability and transparency comes from the moment that records are created, not after 25 years when they're transferred to us, but from the very moment that they're created in a public office or an agency. And how do we ensure that they can be accessed as soon as possible, maybe from the point of creation, if we're lucky. And then finally, this idea that in a hyper-connected world, we can't do this on our own. In the past, it wasn't that difficult to create a system where you put records in boxes and put them in cars and you truck them to us. Now, in an interconnected world, we can't do that by ourselves. We have to work with standards. We have to develop them. We have to work with public offices like the offices that many of you are from and represent, and build that system for the future, working together. I like our vision. People value a vibrant, trusted national archives. We will be a trusted regulator of government information through the Public Records Act, experts in how to create, manage, preserve, and discover information, and a gateway providing access to the nation's history, connecting people to their stories, rights, and entitlements. It's a great vision. And when I've looked at it, because I didn't write it, I didn't create it, I thought this is kind of timeless. You know, it absolutely resonates for me in 2018. But if I went back 61 years to 1957, when the Archives Act existed, I think those words still would have resonated for people. And if I went back another 161 years to 1857, so this is soon after Te Tiriti, but before the suffrage petition was signed, and we use a bit of old-fashioned joined-up writing, those words would still be correct. And if I fast forward in the future and use some futuristic font, those words would still, I think, be true in people's minds and hearts about what a national archives ought to be. And so they are true for us today. So I think that's a really timeless kind of vision. So timeless, in fact, that I think 2057, which is 100 years from 1957, when the Archives Act was enacted and when Archives was created, 100 years, we thought, wow, that's a long time. But actually, that's not that long. I'm Chinese. We go back way further than that. So I just thought, well, what if we pushed it out a little bit further? Go from 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, 400 years. Why not just keep going? Why not? We'll get to the next round number. What's the next round number? 1,000 years. 2957. Maybe we should create a strategy around that. But this idea of a 1,000-year National Archive, because a 1,000-year National Archive needs to exist if we're going to have 1,000 years constitution, or 1,000 years of continuous government, 1,000-year cultural history and heritage for this nation, 1,000 years of accountability of government to its people, 1,000 years of commitments that are made to New Zealanders, and 1,000 years of an Aotearoa that unites us. I think that's a really timeless idea. I think it's time to make archives great again. Thank you. Live long and prosper.
So, Richard, we have some questions up here, Slido poll. So, we'll have a look at them and we've probably got time for one or two.
Nah, don't like any of those. No, okay. How is the digital... I'll just start from the top. Might as well. Oh, yeah, so these are by votes. Okay, well, we should be slightly democratic. How is the digital age and people's expectation of technology affecting the role of us? Well, so that was very much around the theme of taking archives of the people and realizing that instead of people coming to us, coming through our doors, and they've only got 4 locations around the country when they can come to, so when you have people who don't have that privilege of being in a large capital city or a point of presence, then we need to find ways to take archives to them. And that's why mass digitization of our records and our holdings, which is not a trivial thing, as you can imagine, is an important part of our kaupapa and our mission going forward. And then changing our digital channel. I don't know if you've ever gone to archives like gov.nz or Archway. It's kind of old. In fact, archives.gov.nz, that predates the iPad. It hasn't been really changed, so you go to it, it's like, oh. So we've got a project underway to update that and upgrade it and try and make it far more fit for purpose for the future so that it can be used on. Oh, I like that DS9. Okay, which is the best challenger for Kirk? I would probably say Jean-Luc Picard. So I like Kirk, but I think Jean-Luc Picard was a better leader, actually. Okay, do you still mourn the loss of great library Alexandria? Yeah, well, I guess so. I think there were multiple Alexandria libraries and they burnt down, they got rebuilt. But those kinds of things they are really, they do tug at your hearts. Archives and library people, we try to fight this thing called the agents of deterioration, of which one of the forces of deterioration is fire. It's an incredibly powerful, potent force that destroys records. Now with digital, we of course can create copies. Yeah. Does government ever have the right to be forgotten over the very long term? Yeah, that's an interesting point. You know, there's the right to be forgotten and there's the right to remember. I don't have any policy on this yet because I don't think we've really thought too much about it. In terms of accountability for government, it's incredibly important that we remember as much as we need to and can. That's about, you know, key decisions, about policy, about actions that have been taken. So in that respect, you don't ever probably want to forget those. Now, who gets access to that is something that can be controlled, and we have access controls and provisions that allow me as a chief archivist to control some of that. And obviously the Privacy Act then comes into play if there's private information. But a really good example of that is the expungement bill. I can't remember. Someone from Justice will know. The criminal something expungement bill, which looked at people who had in the past had been deemed by the state to have committed an offence because of homosexuality. And we worked quite closely with Justice around, well, you know, do we just get rid of those records? Well, no, we don't want to get rid of those records because actually it's about accountability. That's actually holding government to account for that crazy law, and what do we do about it? So there's ways in which you can redact things and provide a restricted access without ever forgetting. I would hate it if all the poll tax records were thrown away just because the government had made an apology and said, yeah, we shouldn't have done that, Richard. Those things are not just part of accountability, but they're part of my identity and memory. Okay?